Hi, and welcome to the History Hut. I'm Jim. This is Dr. K. Today we'll be discussing the peopling of the Americas, if peopling is in fact a real word. And you're a doctor, so I'll trust you on that one.
Yeah, you don't seem to be trusting me very much on that at all.
So we'll be talking about the great civilizations of the Americas. Where do they come from, or do they start there?
Well,
probably some people that start there.
There absolutely are some people that say that they start here at all. So here we are. We've looked at lots of places in the old world. We'll call it the old world.
The old world, yeah.
And now we're at this new region of the world, one that my old next door neighbour in Scotland, Mr. Gracie, always referred to as the New World. He'd say, Linda, what's it like living in the New World? And I'm like, wow, in the late 20th century, that's quite the question. So we're in this new region of the world, and not only does it become the home of some really great civilizations like the Olmec and the Maya and the Aztec, and then further down the Inca, but it also raises the question, as you pointed out, of the peopling of the Americas. Where do they come from? When do they come? How do they get here? Or in fact, do they just begin here? And of course, for First Nations peoples, especially in Canada and probably in America as well, the question, the fact that scientists are kind of questioning when they got here is quite upsetting, because for Native people, when they look at their own creation myths, their own creation stories, they usually have geographic markers that connect them to like the Rocky Mountains or to the Great Lakes. And so I think because of the politicization in the modern period of things like land claims and the fact that, that governments haven't really been all that supportive of First Nations or Aboriginal or Indigenous or Native peoples, whichever term you want to use, it's become a bit of a political issue. But of course, scientists have to get in there and ruin everybody's parties. And of course, we know that people marched out or walked slowly out of Africa at some point in the deep dark past, and then started moving, right and left. Some went to the right, some went to the left, and went all the way through Europe into Asia. And there's a whole other argument about how people get to Australia, for instance. Then the waters are shallower between Indonesia and the mainland, and then over to Australia, and then how people, in fact, get to the Americas. So there are a couple of accepted versions. The original version, coming in the early 20th century, came after a find at Clovis, New Mexico, and they found projectile points at Clovis, New Mexico, indicating what? Human agency. So if you see projectile points having been made, somebody has to have made them. And that dated the arrival of people in North America anyway at maybe about 13,000 years ago. So that's a fairly conservative estimate, but there's a lot of excitement surrounding that. And the belief was that people had come in likely in about two waves. One maybe and of course, this is after the Clovis find, so you'll see that the dates kind of changed. So the new accepted version after Clovis was that there had been two waves, one at maybe about 28,000 years ago and one at about 17,000 years ago, and that people had actually crossed from the old world. So they had crossed from the area of Siberia or Lake Baikal, Mongolian territory, crossed from there, and they had come across into the New World when there had been a land bridge between the two places. So in other words, you've got all of North America. Yeah, and they're like, oh, a bridge. I don't remember seeing that last week. Let's go. So the idea is that they cross this land bridge when it exists, and we call it Beringia, because that piece of sea, because, Europeans, you name everything after yourself. So that piece of sea is named after Vitus Bering, the Danish sailor. So it's called the Bering Sea. So the land bridge gets the name Beringia. And then you come to the other side. So you cross over the land bridge. You don't realize that you've just left an entire continent. You're on a new one. You're just like, oh, nice bridge. Let's go.
It's before Google Maps, of course.
Exactly. And so You just don't know. And the crazy thing is that this land bridge is there for thousands of years at a time. So it's up, we know, thanks to multidisciplinary studies, we know that it's up at 80,000 years BP before the present, and it's up for about 10,000 years. And then we know that it's up again in the 40,000 period, and then we know it's up again in the 28,000 period. And the last time that we see it is in 8,000 BP, and then the ice melts, the seawater's levels rise, and it's gone forever. So it's not like you would have crossed over and then 2 weeks later said, I think I'll just go back and visit my mom, and go, oh my God, where's the land bridge? I mean, you could have crossed backwards and forwards in that land bridge umpteen times if you'd wanted to. So this is the land bridge theory, the theory that people walked into the Americas. Now, the problem with that is if you just imagine a map of the Americas. So you have ice all the way along the coast, and then you have a huge ice cap all across the rest of the country, and then there's just this small ice-free corridor coming down the middle. So you would have to have crossed over in the land bridge, found the ice-free corridor, gone down the ice-free corridor, managed to survive in that very kind of barren kind of atmosphere into Central America, calling it, they usually call it the Central American Funnel, and either waited it out there until 8,000 BP when the ice recedes and, you can actually move back up, or they would have gone into the South American part of the ice-free corridor. So the problem with that is that there are no bone remains in the North ice-free corridor, and there are tons in the South ice-free corridor. So why, if you'd come that way, why would there be no signs of people having died on that big trek, whereas there are lots and lots of signs in the Southern ice-free corridor? So anyway, this is the original version that people came that way, and so it gives a date of maybe 10 to 20,000 years ago. Now, the newer version, or the alternate version, and one that I think it was Knut Fladmark that came up with this idea, and it, not really well accepted at all, but it seems to be gaining popularity now, and the other version is the transoceanic travel version. It sounds very fancy. Yeah. All that means is
sounds like it would cost more.
I know.
If you were
like a first class. Yeah. Like, I want to be up on the top. So people coming across when the land bridge isn't there. So coming across just regularly in the alternate times from that 80,000 to 70,000 BP. So you just come across, and you come across in little boats, and we know from studies of Polynesian history that people knew how to make these boats long in the deep dark past, and that Polynesians can actually sense land about 3 days away. So without sophisticated navigational tools, we know that because when James Cook was there in the late 18th century, did all sorts of drawings of their vessels, and then of course after that they're devastated by all sorts of diseases and kind of lose that knowledge of building. But we do have kind of records of it anyway. So the other version is people sailed across, and this means that they could have crossed much earlier. So they could have been crossing from 100,000 years ago to 50,000 years ago, all the way up to the very early BC period. This idea is supported by linguistic evidence. So linguists getting in on the act, they're like, we'd like to have some of that action, and discussing the fact that the longer you've been in a place, the more sophisticated the language is, and the more languages there actually are. So looking at the west coast of the Americas and saying there are 500 languages spoken down there, but in the interior there's only one kind of stem language. So thinking that the coastal areas are the ones that have been settled the longest. And in fact, if you look at Australia, it's the same idea there. If you think about, again, imagining your map of Australia, and then there's Indonesia over here. So there's like 278 languages in this top left-hand corner, and then one stem language for the interior. So again, that kind of indicates people coming that way, and it looks then that people might actually have sailed in across the water, or walked across the shallow waters when the water. So really interesting stuff. And this kind of explains some of the other anomalies, if I might use that word. So the other anomalies, we know now that the first sign of village life was in Monte Verde in Chile, so way down at the bottom, 29,000 years ago. So why would people be walking 10,000 years ago when there's a village at the bottom, 29,000 years ago? And then if you think again at your imaginary map of South America, and you think of this side of it, you would see Brazil. course, more famous for football players than anything else, but still, there's a site there called Pedra Furada, and at Pedra Furada, there's been a French archaeologist working there for decades and decades. Nobody really bothered all that much with her work till recently, and she found a kill site. So she found a kill site and fires on the edge of this, like the front of this this mountain, dated the site. So again, human action, because that's what you're looking for.
What's a kill site?
A place where you would slaughter mastodons or bison,
Mastodons.
or yeah. And see, this is the other
I
thing.
hear
The
mastodon
ecology,
steak is delicious.
the ecology is different, and the idea is that people, the hunters, would have followed woolly mammoths. Do you like them? Woolly mammoths, mastodon, massive animals. So 6-foot high beavers. Can you imagine? That'd be scary. So this mega huge. Animals in the environment, so they would have followed those, and that would be the reason for them coming. And the other thing you have to keep in mind is that we're not talking about like 100,000 people coming over. We're talking about maybe 100 people coming over, or 3 boatloads of people making up 50 people. So we're talking about really, really small numbers that would have hit the land bridge or sailed over and hunting these animals. So at Pedra Furada, the kill site date was I think dated to about 30,000, and recently it's been backdated to 50,000 years ago. So that doesn't explain the ice-free corridor on the west coast. If you have, how does anyone then get way over here to the middle of Brazil? But if you were sailing and you'd come down the coast and maybe crossed over at where modern Venezuela is, or where the Panama Canal is, then you would have gone down that way, and it's a bit easier to explain. So it's one of the most exciting areas of study, I think, because with every month that passes, you get new information coming out that threatens to overturn all the ideas that we've had before.
So lots of rewriting of lectures.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. You have to. There was one came out last week on the BBC environmental news, and it was about the Clovis site, and it said that the Clovis theory has now been speared to death. Because they're actually working still in that area, and the findings that they have indicate that the points that they were working with are actually 800 years older than they had thought, and so now they're dating the Clovis site back and saying there were probably people there. So it's really, really interesting. There's a book by Elaine Dewar called Bones, and it's a really cool book because it's all about the archaeologists that kind of made their name with these different theories, and how difficult it's been to break into any of the theories or get them to change, because they've built up their whole careers on it, and they have graduate students that have been working on it. So it's like it's become like this thing you just can't talk about. So anyway, the Clovis thing's been kind of trashed recently. The other thing that I just was reading a little thing, and I found out about this guy, John Erlandson, and he's an archaeologist at the University of Oregon, and he's discovered, with the help of marine archaeologists, the Kelp Highway. Kelp is, of course, as you know, seaweed, and people eat it dried. But his argument is that there's kelp forests growing just offshore of Japan, and on the other side from Alaska all the way down to South America. And so there's it goes to Baja, and then it's a little break, and then South America all the way down to Chile. And according to him, this provided, there's lots of fish there, lots of shellfish there. Seals and otters live there. And the cool thing about it is that because it's an underwater forest, it reduces wave energy, so it makes it easier for people to navigate by boat. And so it would have provided the absolute perfect food source for people that had sailed over, because you wouldn't sail over and then go, oh, and there's a big load of ice, I think I'll just try and build something on that. You would sail to the coast, and then you would sail down the coast. So if there were any settlements, they would be very small, and then you would use this new this new source of food from the water. So you've got that too. So linguists supporting the sea crossing and giving the most liberal dates of maybe 50 to 100,000 years ago that people were here. The bone evidence isn't good because the soil in the Americas is acidic and it eats through bones, so they haven't got any real complete skeletons, although they have lots of skulls in Brazil and places like that, but no complete skeletons. The kill sites and the fire pits, that supports an earlier arrival by sea as well. And then you have the DNA, people, so they're looking for hair follicles. So it'd be like CSI. So you're in a huge site like California looking for a hair follicle. It's very, very difficult. So they originally said that you could show from the DNA that people had been here about 10 to 15,000 years ago. But now they're using mitochondrial DNA, that's from the mother's line. They've got dates of 30,000 years ago, and using the newest Y chromosome tracing father to son, they have dates of about 20,000 years ago. So genetics point to at least 20,000 years ago, maybe upwards of 30,000 years ago. And they point to the Lake Baikal area, mentioned the kind of Mongolian area. And if you look there, there's been lots of archaeological work done there by Japanese and Russian teams, and they have artifact evidence that dates back about 40,000 years. So it's just a case of kind of finding it on the other side. There is another alternate theory, and I think it was a documentary that I saw on TV, and it was an archaeologist who was in the south of France, and he was just looking through this as far as I can remember, this tiny little village museum, and he was looking at, points, projectile points, and the curator said, "Oh, are you interested in this?" He's like, "Oh, yeah, I really am. Oh, I've got tons in the back." Went to the back and looked, and it was exactly the same as Clovis points, and so then his idea was then that it was actually the people done the cave paintings in France and Spain that had come up, and they were responsible for Clovis. So in other words, it was French people that had colonized what would later be French people colonizing French people in the New World. So really, really interesting stuff. And as I said, always kind of open to debate. And the last thing is the Kennewick Man. Do you remember that?
Nope.
I don't remember that. It's 1996, bit of a fuss. There was a boat race on the Columbia River. There were two fans watching it in a boat, looked over, saw a skull in the riverbank and took it to the local authorities. They called in an archaeologist, James Chatters, and his team was able to actually recover the whole skeleton. And they dated it immediately to really, really old. They're like, oh, it's about 9,000 years old. And the problem was that it looked from the face to be of European descent, so it caused this absolute storm. And the problem was that the place it was found was maintained by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, but it was considered the traditional land of 6 different native tribes, including the Amatilla. And according to a 1990 law, which is the Native American Graves and Repatriation Act, if human remains are found on federal land and their cultural affiliation can be established, then they have to be returned to the appropriate tribe. So in this case, the Umatilla made their claim. But of course, it's also really important for archaeologists, and they were just, chomping at the bit to get in on this. So 8 scientists sued right away to be allowed to look at the body, to be able to study the body. And judgment was reached in 2 years later, September of '98, and the bones were sent to a Seattle museum. And then, again, the legal fight continued. So it wasn't until 2005 that the scientists were allowed to get anywhere near the body. And when they did, they were given 10 days access, and that was it. And then it was to be reburied. So it was actually quite a big story at the time. The results started to reach the public in 2006, and it turns out that the skeleton was neither North American Indian, nor was it European. It didn't really fit into any of the racial categories that anybody had established. They found that the body was buried in the riverbank on purpose, that the guy was about 5'9", right-handed, and probably about 38 years old, very muscular, had lots of injuries, but none of them had caused his death. And they radiocarboned him to 9,400 years old. So just really, really difficult. The problem was that they hadn't stored all of the bones properly, and so there had been some damage to the bones as well. But they found out at the end, they said, no, actually he didn't have a European face at all, that it looked as though he was from the Jomon period in Japan or the Ainu of Japan. So it looks as though it's either Japanese or maybe even Polynesian. So that's another interesting kind of finding. And the Ainu, I guess, don't look like modern Japanese people. They have really light skin and wavy hair, and they have kind of non-Asian looking eyes, according to the archaeologists. So Kennewick's important then because it raised this massive question about what do you do with with not only with bodies, but what do you do when science comes up against this kind of thing, and it raised the whole question again of whether it was a land bridge crossing and where these people had come from. So it would kind of fit in with the Japanese Kelp Highway thing more than it would the walking out of possibly walking north to Siberia, crossing Japan to Siberia up there, and then over and out. So really just absolutely fascinating area because it changes regularly, and but each of the groups defends their own territory quite well. And I could point out as well, and I should point out as well, that if you look at Old Crow and the Bluefish Caves up north, there are dates there now for 29,000 years ago as well. So you've got really old dates at the bottom, old dates at the top. We know everything's covered in ice, so what are the other possibilities? So it's like really, really cool stuff.
So lots of people knocking about thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago. Well, that does it for part one of our discussion of the peopling of the Americas.
That's right.
Join us for part two.
Accept that now, do you?
Yeah,
Okay.
whatever. Part two, coming up.